I just wanted to make a brief video here discussing my fascination with this particular album and its critical reception. I think the album's magnificent, it's a great listen, it's exemplary, and I was interested in how this was considered ultimately The Who's finest achievement. My favourite personally is actually The Who Sell Out, although this would probably be my second favourite, maybe Quadrophenia in third. That can be a holy trinity. Now, this Who's Next project was not initially as Townsend had intended it. It was meant to be even more of a follow-up to Tommy. It was meant to be another rock opera. It wasn't as though, I got the rock opera out of my system, let's do another regular album, and then we'll return to the rock opera in Quadrophenia. We were meant to have a trilogy of rock operas, in a sense. Ultimately, Lighthouse didn't pan out, and we were left with Who's Next in the end. And it's hard to imagine. I know, history's been this way for nearly 50 years now. Actually, yeah, pretty much 50 years now. But still, there is that feeling that if Who's Next had been different, if it had been changed in any way, we can't imagine the album being any different now. What would the response have been? Do we really wish it was Lighthouse instead? It's hard to say, because in a respect, I think a lot of the reason why Who's Next was so adored by so many critics was because, and why so many people have gravitated it to this day as a great rock CD in that era, is just because it's a brilliant compact collection of extraordinary songs. And they're still connected by a theme. We don't need any rock opera kind of fillers to explain what's happening in the story. I think what happened was the songs that evolved organically, that happened to be inspired by some sort of storyline, the songs that worked, they put them together in a track list. And it makes you think, I mean, I'm not the biggest, Tommy, I dig Tommy, but there are many tracks on Tommy where I think, God, this really didn't need to be here. They're just trying to fill out the story, they're just trying to fill pages. Quadrophenia is a lot better with this, I think. Quadrophenia, there's more of the songs seem to evolve organically, and they don't just feel like filler and just, okay, we need to get from A to B. And it's a lot to do with why Who's Next has been such a, I can consider such a strong album, I feel, and why I think it's, the material on here is brilliant. I think the Lighthouse concept could have been amazing, don't get me wrong. And part of the reason I feel that way is because the themes, insofar as they emerge on this album, are so potent. This is 1979, the hippie movement failed, I guess. That's the popular, well, I guess the ideals of the hippie movement, as the hippie movement expected the 70s to look a lot different than they were beginning to look after Altamont, and just each year, I guess they anticipated each year would be more peaceful and loving than the last, and that just wasn't happening. And once their expectations were shattered even to some degree, they figured it was all over. I mean, that's how strong their utopian feelings were, I think. Once there was any indication that that there had to be that it wasn't going to be as easy as it seemed, they balked a little, I think. I'm not judging this, it just is what it is. And so with Who's Next, there's a real feeling of, wow, it's the hangover of Tommy, it's the hangover of the hippie movement. Where do we go now? Meet the new boss, same as the old boss. Hopefully we won't get fooled again. I mean, it's all over this album, and I don't, maybe initially viewing the album cover prior to realizing it, there's urine stains on a in the middle of it. It has this very profound feeling, and you think, yeah, it's these young guys thinking, yeah, where do we go from now? What do we do after Tommy? What do? We will go out wandering the wilderness and see what happens. Maybe they were inspired a little bit by the Led Zeppelin phenomenon, because sometimes this is the heaviest Who album yet. Live at Leeds had just been released. Typically, you weren't allowed to include your heavy qualities of your rock group on the recording, because the record companies would be telling you, look, this is going to be played on people's little AM radios. You don't, if it's released as a single, so don't bother. Don't bother. Just, if you want to have your heaviness out there, put out a live album. And that was the Live at Leeds. It's the only Who album that sounds like that. And then Led Zeppelin rock up, and they start making heavier music. And I think Pete Townshend has made I've heard him make a couple of remarks about how he hates Led Zeppelin. Given what I suspect Pete Townshend's sense of humor is like, I think he actually quite envied Led Zeppelin, and that's where if he did hate them, if he was being honest, that's where the honesty was coming from. He kind of wished he'd gotten to that first. I mean, I Can See for Miles was the heaviest song at that time. That's what inspired Paul McCartney to do Helter Skelter, not Paul McCartney. So I think Pete Townshend always saw himself as a architect of heavy metal that never got the credit for it, that Jimmy Page was getting the credit for it instead, for example. Now, that could just be me composing a narrative around the fact that Glyn Johns is credited as an engineer on Led Zeppelin's debut album, and then appears to have been quickly snatched up by The Who to be a co-producer on Who's Next. So, yeah, make of that what you will. No, seriously, The Who's Next is a brilliant document of rock music. No wonder the average Triple M rock fan loves this so much. Like Led Zeppelin 4, this is really elevating that 70s rock sound to this fantastic Odyssey's novel experience. It's extraordinary. All the songs are amazing, the production's outstanding, and all the songs are bangers. I mean, the track list is beyond legendary at this point. I mean, even if you hadn't heard the album yet, you've heard half the songs and you're like, oh, well, this album's going to be amazing. If it's got Barbara O'Reilly and Bargain as their first two tracks, you may not have heard Love Ain't For Keepin' yet, but that's a beautiful song. My Wife I'm not the biggest fan of for the most part, although when the song starts to finish and close and there's an outro and there's that horn section coming in, doot, doot, doo, she's coming, doot, doot. Then I like the song. Leading up to that, it's a bit of a plod, I'm afraid. But that, I feel like that, doot, 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 she's coming, that's good stuff. Song is over. Beautiful. I'll sing my song to the wide open spaces. No, I'm not going to do that for you. I'm not Roger Daltrey. He's a great rock vocalist, and I'm not that. Getting in tune's good stuff. Riding over you. I just said I wouldn't do that, but it's infectious. Going mobile. I'm going mobile. Behind Blue Eyes is I there was a younger co-worker at a job I once had. I overheard him singing this song, and I was like, "Yeah, The Who, that's a great song." He's like, "Oh, Limp Bizkit." I mean, I'm not that old. I'm not. I was born a couple of years before Limp Bizkit really took off, I think. I guess if they took off in 1999, I was born a few years before that. This person was younger than me, so they're even less removed from the history of The Who than I was. Oh my god. Won't get fooled again. It doesn't get much better than that, does it, guys? And does Who's Next set a precedent, importantly, that a great album with a permeating and fully realized concept does not need to be a rock opera or contain songs which are specifically poised to be some sort of libretto? If Tommy was taking the album and rock album in kind of a wrong direction, they immediately sprang back. Who's Next is a counter argument to Tommy. If you want to shit on The Who for Tommy and what they did there, you can seek solace in the fact that, well, especially live at Leeds is the opposite in one sense, but Who's Next in a studio sense is still the exact opposite. I think Pete Townshend expected Tommy to change the world so intensely, and when it didn't, there was this counter reaction. He saw all the problems in Tommy and sought to, I mean, maybe not, because maybe that's because he's trying to do another rock opera, but maybe that was still trying to correct Tommy. The end result, there's still, as a story you can gauge from Who's Next, maybe it's more of a collection of short stories than a novel, although, nevertheless, this end result, is one really surprised that the hard rock fans, you know, they're not people who just want to hear old school 70s hard rock. If there are albums better than Who's Next, they belong to different genres. There are a few albums of this particular bracket better than Who's Next. You have to go to Zeppelin 4 or something like that. Sincerely, like, there's no surprise to me why Who's Next is as revered as it is by its fans and by people who love The Who and love rock music, the Rolling Stone magazine crowd. And I have to say, I'm so bowled over, and as much as I would have loved to have heard The Lighthouse, I've heard a recording of the demo of Pete Townshend singing a slower piano led teen song, Barbara O'Reilly, where it's still titled Teenage Wasteland. It's very beautiful. I would have loved to have, a part of me would love to hear, really would love to hear Lighthouse. But there's no denying that Who's Next being what it is, it being exactly what it is, is what has set it this classic status, and there's nothing in the popular culture that pines for what it could have been. It simply is. That's a lesson for it's a lesson for the history of rock albums subsequent to it, because if they'd followed it up with another rock opera, things could have been very different in the history of rock music. I mean, Quadrophenia kind of salvaged the concept, I suppose, and then you had things like The Wall later on. So who knows? Who